Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. And we'll come back to this passage soon. One man says, I'll tell you what a real woman is. A real woman is a blonde, says a man who doesn't know what he's talking about. Another man says, no, wait a minute, a real woman is a brunette. And then if you have Tom Taylor preaching, he says, no, wait a minute, a real woman is a what? A redhead, a fiery redhead. A real woman is a woman who looks a certain way and has a certain disposition and attitude. Somebody says, let me tell you what a real man is. It's somebody who is tall, dark, and handsome. And so somebody who is short, bald, and handsome is a little confused. Like Matt Ford doesn't know how to understand all of that. Because I don't know what you think about Matt Ford, but he's way up here to me. I think the world of him. Don't we get into this deal where we evaluate people on really very shallow bases that really is not at all what tells us what a person is. It's so surface, and it's just very shallow. We do the same thing with churches, but more so. What does it mean to be a really solid church? Well, you believe particular things in terms of this list of our doctrinal standards, or you worship a certain way, or your culture is somewhat a mirror of culture that we live in. And so the role of women is such that you can't tell a whole lot of difference between the world and the church. What does it mean to really see a church that is blessed? And I want this morning to just get to the heart of a little deeper evaluation. And let's go to this next slide. As we do this, I want to put these items on the table for you. If you go to there you go. You think about these items. Ezekiel chapter 34, you know the chapter where the prophet is rebuking the shepherds of Israel because they care about themselves more than about the sheep. And there's a whole chapter where he just blisters the shepherds of Israel. And then John chapter 10, the passage where Jesus says, listen, I'm the good shepherd. And that's in contrast to what happened in chapter 9, where Jesus heals the man who's blind from the synagogue. And it's a contrast between the kind of shepherd that Jesus is, he reaches out to this guy, and the kind of shepherds the religious leaders were, who were concerned about whether it was right to heal him, and whether he was the right person. Was he really the one who was blind? And how did this happen? And then you have on the other side of John 10, John 11, where Lazarus is raised from the dead. And so there's the good shepherd who gives life, and there are the other leaders who are more concerned about taking life if you step out of line. And you look at the Maccabean revolt. You look at the Feast of Dedication that's spoken of in John chapter 10, a feast that really isn't in the Old Testament because it happens between the Testaments, and it's where Antiochus Epiphanes, he goes too far as he sacrifices a pig on the altar. And he inspires the white-hot anger of the Jewish people, and they say no more, and they have all these all these priests that are corrupt and politically motivated, and they overthrow that. And with the Maccabean revolt, the Feast of Dedication comes along, what we call Hanukkah. And that comes along and it celebrates a renewal of leadership, where our leadership is no longer corrupt, and our leadership is now as it ought to be. Whenever you think about Isaiah's suffering servant, as he talks about the king of Assyria, you even have Cyrus functioning in a good way in the book of Isaiah. You have Hezekiah and other kings of Judah, and they are good kings, but they're not good enough. And ultimately, the suffering servant, the king, will come and he'll do what you don't expect. He's going to be the kind of king who suffers for you. All of this is there with the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. What does all this have in common? All of it has in common something that's very important. Let's go to the next slide. Any of you know this man? Who is this man? What is his mission? What's it mean for a religious leader to really serve you? He can heal your cancer. He can heal your back problem. He can take care of your financial woes. He'll also sell you a cloth for several $100s that he touched, and sell you prayer cloths as he makes $500,000 to $700,000 a year exploiting widows' money from the church. Let's go to the next slide. It's not just the people who are so outrageous, but also some people who are more sophisticated, more formal, and they're driven by political power and prestige and insulation, where they really have no accountability. And yet, they are the people we go to for a blessing. Let's go to the next slide. You know these folks? Yeah. Let's go to the next one. I didn't want to leave the deacons out because I know the deacons are leaders too, right? And there are leaders who are on neither of these sites. Let's go to the next slide. But what we have to do is contrast these fellas with the religious landscape. What I want to do this morning is I hope you will see that this church has a beauty. It's a whole lot deeper than being blonde or brunette or tall or handsome. This church has at its core that which determines whether or not churches are legitimate or not. And there's a kind of beauty here. And whenever I think about your leadership, our leadership, because I'm a part of this congregation as well, that whenever I think about our leadership, the leadership of the church is always, and always is a strong word, but it's not an exaggeration, it's always an expression of you. You are responsible for your leaders. And they are an expression of who you are. So whenever I unpack this message, I am unpacking something about you as a group, something about you as a church that is very, very important. Let's go to the next slide. Now, what in the world does this have to do with Matthew? I see that I put too much stuff on there. A little busy, but I think we'll work through this. What does this have to do with the Sermon on the Mount? I'm going to speak on the Beatitudes, but I want to give you the point of the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to make sure that you're seeing it in context, because the Beatitudes mean something. It's not just what I feel whenever I come to these texts, but it's bringing something to me that I am to receive. Not something I'm to bring to the text, but something I get from this text. And whenever I look at Matthew as a whole, that whole gospel, there are a few things that give me a clue into what Matthew is about. And the first thing is the genealogy, where he has women mentioned in his genealogy, which is different. Not only that, but there's a common element in every single woman that's mentioned in the genealogy, and that is that all of them were scandalous and were outsiders in the sense of the reputation they had in the Jewish community. That's the first thing. That's a clue to the kinds of people he's writing to. There's a second clue, and it's the call of Matthew. And whenever you look at the call of Matthew, the author of this document, as he is called in Matthew 9:9 and following, the first thing that happens after Jesus interacts with Matthew and he goes to have dinner with Matthew at Matthew's house, the first thing that happens is that Jesus is criticized by the leaders of Israel. The leaders criticize him. Why are you interacting with people like Matthew? Sinners and tax collectors. Why are you associating with these people? So think about that from Matthew's experience. Matthew's experience is such that Jesus reached out to me. He called me. He invited me to a connection with him. And then he came to my house. And one of the first things that happened was I saw him get criticized for it. Jesus was persecuted because of connecting with somebody like me. And I see how he responded. That's a clue into what Matthew is all about. It's written to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, who are the lost sheep because the leaders of Israel, that those sheep, and this is key, depend upon. They depend upon those shepherds. They lean on those shepherds. They trust those shepherds. They believe that if God wants something done, he'll communicate it through these shepherds. They believe if something is wrong, these shepherds will tell them. If something's right, these shepherds will tell them. They depend upon these shepherds for the blessing from God. And yet, these very shepherds they depend upon have neglected them because they're more concerned about their own validation. The next thing that Matthew gives us that no other writer gives us is chapter 23. The only thing you can find that's close to it is Ezekiel 34 in the Old Testament. Nothing in the New Testament. A blistering passage where Jesus is blistering the religious leaders. Let's go on to the next slide and then the next one. Yes, I don't know if you can surely see that because I want to make a point on this. In chapter 23, you know the passage, they love these long phylacteries. They love the seats of honor at the banquets. They love to be called master and rabbi and doctor and master and all that academic stuff. They love that stuff. It's all about their ego. Everything they do is done to be seen of men. They are driven by their ego. They're driven by a need to be validated. Make me feel important. I've got to feel important. And if I'm representing God, I'm the gatekeeper to God, what better place is there than that? And so these religious leaders are not so much sacrificing to care for these sheep as much as they are using the sheep and feeding off of the sheep to exploit them and to make themselves feel important in their communities and in their families and in their homes. These are empty leaders who are not leading at all. They are milking the sheep and butchering them. These are butchers. And so he talks about them. He says, you're blind, you're straining at gnats and you're swallowing camels. You're the blind leading the blind. He says, you're a son of hell. You travel land and sea to win a single convert. When you do, you turn them into twice as much a son of hell as you are. You're going to hell. There is no more clear place in Scripture where Jesus is that harsh and says, y'all are going to hell. He says that to these leaders. That's what's going on in Matthew. Matthew is one of those sheep. He's one of those people who trusted the leadership that let him down. They didn't serve him, they served themselves. They weren't driven by caring for the sheep. They were driven by ego. That's what's going on. That's why Matthew's written, is to reach out to those kinds of people. In other words, Matthew is the best document in the entire Bible when it comes to healing spiritual abuse. And it's always been a problem. Always. It always will be a problem. Always. There will always be counterfeit voices and shepherds. Always. Now, I want you to notice in this blistering chapter 23, where he rebukes these leaders, I want you to notice verse 1, where he does not give this rebuke to the leaders. His disciples said, they're concerned about what you're doing. He says, don't worry about them. Why? Because they're the blind leading the blind. In other words, you're wasting your time if you think you're going to reach these people. Let them go. Jesus doesn't speak to those leaders on this because they wouldn't listen. But he's speaking to the victims. And that's important because whenever it comes to the people who have been victimized by this, the key is not to go in and blister all of the people that are abusing them. It's to say, you know, the real problem is this. It's who you're going to get your blessing. Now, when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount, let's go to the next slide. And the next one? Yeah, let's just back on up to that next one. The one you were, yeah, there you go. Okay, now you can't see all of this, but I have zeroed in on the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Because in the NIV and in the ESV and a couple of other translations, you'll see this. It's not clear in all of them, but it's there. And it's the word there. And so after Jesus is through with the Sermon on the Mount, and Matthew has been quoting Jesus, and now he comes in not to quote Jesus, but to narrate. He's editing. He is, as an editor, saying, this is the point. Whenever Jesus is through being quoted, Matthew tells us, now when he finished these things, the crowds were amazed because he taught as one who had authority and not as their scribes and teachers of the law. Whose leaders were those people? The people who were the recipients of the Sermon on the Mount. In other words, the Sermon on the Mount is intended to call the people who have been abused spiritually to stop being abused by no longer being dependent on those leaders for the blessing. The blessing can come in the wilderness. The blessing can come far away from the temple and from Harding University. Are you listening to me? Now, I am a big fan of Bruce McClarty. I love him and I respect him. But it's true of all institutions, in all religious groups, that as they consolidate power, people look to them for the blessing, for the endorsement. You're the one that makes us legitimate. You have more legitimacy if you graduate from Harding with a degree in Bible than you just go to Sunday school class. And we put something on that. Now, that's not all bad, but we have to be careful. Because what we depend upon for the blessing is ultimately not the people in charge. There's something deeper. So, let's go to the next slide. Here we have with the Beatitudes, just a quick rundown. I don't want to get too much into detail because I think sometimes we complexify this and it's really pretty simple. At this part of the sermon, what the Beatitudes are doing, what they're doing is a couple of things. They are capturing the attention of the people by telling them something they don't expect to hear. Okay? It is capturing attention by telling you what you don't expect and what just doesn't make sense, and then it's going to be unpacked. But not only that, it gives you the first cue of what these people are supposed to do. And they are not admonitions where you're supposed to go do these things. For example, blessed are those who are persecuted. You don't go out and seek persecution. But these are blessings. In other words, it says, listen, do you want to know what's going on? Do you want to know what's going on? Then you look at the people God endorses. Look at who it is that God favors. Look at who it is that God honors. And it's not who you think. It's not who you think. It's not the people with the biggest robes. It's not the people with the longest degrees. That's not it at all. All of that stuff is totally irrelevant. Who is it? Notice how it's framed. The poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The blessing is, if you're not prideful, if you are open, if you're like Matthew. Matthew's one who heard Jesus say, you love those who love you. So what? How does that make you different? You know, don't even people like Matthew, tax collectors and sinners, love those who love them? Jesus said that, but Matthew wrote that. And the fact that Matthew wrote it says he had a poor spirit. It wasn't, who do you think you are, Jesus, talking about me like that? No, there was a poor spirit, a humbleness, a receptivity, an openness, a willingness to say, you know, that does describe me. I do need some changes in my life. And with that poor spirit, that's where God rules. That's where God reigns. God will lead us. God is our Lord whenever we are humble before Him. Whenever we look at those who mourn, God's going to comfort you. He's not saying exactly why or how. It doesn't tell you all the specifics here. And we don't want to get caught up in that because that will distract us from the point of this stuff. But the idea that those who mourn, it's not those who are so happy. They're people who are hurting. They're people who are in pain. Those are the people that we ought to be going to. Those are the people that will be comforted. It's the meek who will inherit the earth. A whole lot is in that. And that's from Genesis all through Revelation is the whole idea of inheriting the earth. It's the new heavens and the new earth of Revelation. But those people who are meek, who have power that's under control, they don't have to tell you everything they can do. They don't have to do everything they can do, but they have meekness. Those people are able to do things that you can't imagine. And those people are the ones who will eventually fulfill the purpose of creation, and they will co-rule with God, and they will manage the creation, and they will inherit the earth. The hunger and thirst for righteousness, those who crave that, your appetite, that ache in your heart will be filled. Those who are merciful will receive mercy. The pure in heart, a great blessing. You will see what God is like. It's not how much you study, though that's important. It's the purity of your heart. And what you bring to the table along those lines will determine whether you see God or not. The peacemakers will go to where there is no peace. Do you realize that? Peacemakers go where there is no peace. So you know what they say about peacemakers? Peacemakers love conflict, because they always gravitate toward conflict. No, there's a difference in a peacemaker and a peace faker. A peace faker is somebody who says, everything's great, nobody's in conflict, nobody has any issues. No, a peacemaker goes where there is no peace and creates peace. And those are the people who are like God. They will be called His children. There are people who are persecuted. And this is the point as well. And I know it's the point because it's the only beatitude. It's the last beatitude. It's the one that frames the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. But also it's the only beatitude that is unpacked. And so it's explained for a couple of verses afterwards. And so he unpacks this one. He doesn't unpack into the other ones. And this is where it really gets. If you get your blessing from God, let me tell you, there are some people with egos who aren't going to like it. If you bless the people that others don't bless, there are people who are not going to like it. And you cannot do it without persecution. This world hated Jesus, and Jesus said in the farewell speech of the Gospel of John, if they hated me, will they not hate you? What do you expect? Why do you think they wouldn't? Why do we think we wouldn't have issues? We can expect it. Let's go on to the last slide. Just a few reflections that I want to leave you with. Whenever you look at these Beatitudes, I would really love for you to be able to just read these Beatitudes in their context, because, man, they become so rich when you see the setting that they have, the frame around the picture.